Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke, and if you're here for the Mishima Livestream Film Club, welcome. It's nice to see you. Let's just wait a little bit. Just excuse me while I'm setting up here. So just give it a couple more minutes, and then we'll go from there. Oh, sorry about that. I'm just setting up, just getting everything ready before we start in about a couple minutes. So I hope you're doing well. And so just give me a second here. And in the meantime, just, yes, hello. And we'll start chatting in about 4 minutes. Excuse me while I have a sip of water. Let's see. Okay. I should really put my computer maybe here. Gosh, I always forget to do. Let me just put my computer like this. Oh, that's probably better. Okay, I'll do that. Here we go. Okay. Well, that's a really bad picture. Yeah, that I have to change that picture for the live stream thing. It's just my picture I took of the booklet. I'll change that if I can. Okay, great. So already we're seeing, oh, Fleagle Floral, hello. How are you doing? I hope you're well. JR62, hello, my friend. I hope you're doing well. Michael Hewitt, hello. Welcome. It's nice to see you, gentlemen. So I hope everyone is doing well and that you enjoyed the film Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters. So, okay. Excuse me here. Again, I'm just getting set up here. I don't think, I'm not sure how many, let's see. Oh yes, Paul Emery says, oh hello Paul, and you say, could you touch on the Japanese reaction to Mishima? Yeah, that's very interesting because it's actually quite a complicated question. Because it was never given a release here in Japan, so there's that. And also, or are you talking about, I think you mean the film Mishima, but if you're referring to the film Mishima, it's actually quite a complicated question. It's quite a complicated answer because, well, I'll get into that. So, but it's actually quite complicated. So, I'll also get into it as well. But the Criterion Collection Blu-ray goes into these details quite well. They're not all collected in one single supplement that one could watch. That's something that's called the reaction to Mishima in Japan or something like that. But this information is spread out over a number of supplements, and I think if one watches them as a whole, one can get a clear picture of it. For instance, there's Kyoko Schrader's interview, her audio interview, where she is talking about the reaction of Madame Mishima, the widow of Yukio Mishima and the keeper of the Yukio Mishima estate in many ways. Her reaction to the production in the film. Also, Alan Poole and Paul Schrader talk about that, her reaction to the production during their commentary to the film. There's also information about this given by one of the producers, Mata Yamamoto, who is also interviewed for one of the supplements of the film, one of the documentary supplements of the film. There's also information given about the reaction from Japanese, the executive side of things at Toho Toa, and their their reaction to the film after it had been made, but before any decision was made to not release it in Japan. There's information about that in other supplements. There's also the essay here, which is called Banned in Japan. It's a second essay here, which is talking about, I don't think I don't think the word banned is actually that accurate. I wouldn't call it banned in Japan. It was just never shown in Japan, given an official release, because one of the studios, the main Japanese financer, Towa Toho, who put in about half of the money in the film, ended up not distributing the film in Japan. And the speculation that's given in the supplemental material on the Criterion Collection release is that this was probably due to the influence of Madame Mishima, the widow of Yukio Mishima, and the actual keeper of the estate. And so, while she couldn't necessarily prevent the actual film being made, much to what appeared to be her chagrin, the notion was suggested that perhaps she or maybe some other elements had something to do with not getting the film distributed, or to put it maybe more specifically, maybe there were some pockets of Japan that were that perhaps might have convinced the studio exec powers that be that it was not a worthwhile thing to release the film in Japan. And so therefore the film has never been officially released through theater distribution here in Japan, as far as I'm aware. Now, there have been people who've seen the film, of course, and Kyoko Schrader, in her great audio interview that's included on the Criterion Collection supplement, actually does refer to this element, that there were people who did see the film around the time of its production, or around that time, 1985, 1986, I should say, and that it became a big positive thing amongst Japanese filmmaker artists. And in fact, she actually describes it very interestingly. She says that I think from her point of view, the way she understood it, Japanese artists and filmmakers who had seen the film were in fact angry that the film wasn't given a proper release in Japan, because it was never released. So, and this has a lot to do with the subject matter of the film, and which is what I want to touch upon today, which is Yukio Mishima himself, the man, the author, and ultimately the person who perhaps became, at least outside of Japan at least, most well known, although I don't want to stick to that, but perhaps one of the things he became very famous for, or infamous for, was what he did on November 25th, 1970. So, and that's probably something that's one aspect that we understand that was probably a bit troublesome for some people who were viewing the production of this film. There's another major aspect of Yukio Mishima that I think was troublesome for those who were concerned about protecting the legacy of Yukio Mishima and the sort of the reputational legacy of Yukio Mishima, let me put it that way. But anyway, my friends, that's just getting ahead of myself, so sorry about that. I was just mentioning that as a kind of way to pass the time. But I see we're a little bit over by 4 minutes, so let's begin in earnest here. Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends, and this is Daisuke, and it's my pleasure to join you in this next live stream film club. Today, the film that I'd love to discuss with you and to hear your thoughts about, and maybe debate with you, who knows, is this film Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters. This is from 1985. This particular release that I have here is the Criterion Collection Blu-ray, spine number 432 in the Criterion Collection for those who are interested. But this has also been made available through other means. I am not the expert when it comes to the release history of this particular film. So if you've seen it through other means, wonderful. Please note, before we move ahead, that I will be speaking to this film about, I'll be speaking to specific aspects of this film, and I would assume that people who are in the live chat will probably speak to specific points of this film as well, which means that for anyone who has not seen the film Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, I would strongly suggest that you thank you very much for coming here and joining this live stream. It's great to see you. Of course, it's great to see you, but it's probably worth it to hold off on this live stream. You don't have to join now. I urge you to watch this film first, and then you can come back. This live stream will later be uploaded as a video on the YouTube channel, so you can always come back to this video at any time if you so wish. Also, I should say that comments, you can leave your comments in the live chat, which is ongoing, which is great. I will, however, I should say two things: that I cannot get to every single comment. I will certainly do my best, but if I do not address your comment directly, I sincerely apologize, and it's just an oversight on my part. But I will certainly do my best. And you can always reach me, you can try to reach me afterwards, after the fact, in a comment after the video is uploaded, or through other means, maybe through a comment on another video or something like that. But I will certainly try to address your comment. But if for whatever reason I miss you, please forgive me. The other thing about live stream comments is that anything related to Mishima is fair game. Anything else, I will just ignore. So if you have any comments about any other film, if you're here to want to talk about another film, thank you for your enthusiasm, but this is probably not the best time to do that, and so I will just ignore that comment or anything like that. So and I encourage everyone else to do the same. If anyone comes in with just a random film discussion or point or comment or whatever, just ignore it and just move on. So it's not worth wasting one's time, because time is very limited for all of us. And so let's talk about Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, and everything that we think that entails and involves. So okay, so with those parameters and those threshold manners, so to speak, out of the way, let's dive into this film, Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, which I'm assuming now that all of you have seen. What did you think of this film? Yes, what did you think of this film, Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters? Let's let me just take a step back and just give you just a general sense of what this film is and what I think it is, and then we'll go from there, and I'll start addressing the live chat comments. But so Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, focuses on the real life figure of Yukio Mishima. And Mishima he was an author. He's an author and a writer and a thinker during the mid to late 20th century in Japan. And for many years there, he was considered to be one of, if not the top writer, thinker, author, intellectual in Japan. And his reputation and fame was quite enormous, both inside Japan and also outside of Japan. There was much talk during the time that he was alive and he was active, that he was He would be considered for instance, the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, for whatever that's worth it to anyone out there who values literature and the critical viewing of literature from a certain aspect, of course. But maybe more broadly speaking, his literature does have an impact. It has a certain there are many elements in his works, if we can broadly characterize them. And his works, I think, are characterized by a very interesting use of language, of Japanese language, which I'll get to in a second. His works also are characterized by very, for lack of a better phrase perhaps, dramas that have an almost in-your-face type of approach to them. They have, they don't seem to follow a kind of, a certain aspect of Japanese literature. In other words, they have they can be seen in many respects to be maybe more shocking. They do deal with elements of Japanese society that are painted in these stories that approach certain aspects of life in a very shocking way, or in a very unusual way, sometimes in a very violent way, and therefore, and also sometimes in a very beautiful way. And so this is I'm trying to be as broad and as vague as possible, but this all comes together in a number of works, novels and criticisms and essays and plays, and also it comes out in other projects, artistic projects that Mishima himself was involved in, films, etc., that essentially create this persona, this huge persona, almost larger than life persona, that is Yukio Mishima. And he himself was very intelligent. He presented himself very well on camera when he was interviewed, not only in Japanese, but also in English, and also in one respect, for a Criterion supplement, in French as well. Excuse me. And he was a very, how should I put it? He was a very attractive figure, especially, I think, for people outside of Japan. And his works were translated, not all of them, but some of his major works are translated in other languages. And so therefore his reach outside of Japan was quite considerable when compared, let's say, to other Japanese authors at the time, his contemporaries. So I think his fame and his popularity should be emphasized here. He was also a figure that I think had a lot of contradictions and a lot of interesting, fascinating, confusing, and bewildering, and maybe oftentimes frustrating, but always fascinating, different aspects to his character and his persona and his works that seem to maybe go in all sorts of places. There's also this notion, which hopefully I'll get into later when discussing the supplements here. There's also this notion that he, as a persona, was a person that tried to invent himself, that tried to create a persona that wasn't necessarily who he was at his core, at least when he was young. And but as he grew and as he for lack of a better word, evolved, as his persona evolved, it became clear. It wasn't clear what was the artist and what was the man, if you know what I mean. Perhaps it became one and the same, or perhaps he thought it became one and the same, but perhaps it wasn't that at all. It's all still very confusing to me. But in any event, there is this. Then you add into that his ultra right-wing nationalism, which he publicly espoused and he was speaking about. This is this idea of his his outward devotion to the Japanese emperor, and the concept that the emperor was a deity, and also this idea that now that Japan is a democracy, and that there is a clear-cut separation between the Japanese government and also the emperor system. What he's saying is that it should go back to this idea of the emperor as being the center and soul of Japan, and also linked intrinsically with that is this idea of his devotion to the samurai and the samurai ethic and the ethos and the way of life of the samurai. And this is becoming something that, and then this therefore becomes what his notion of Japan, at least what he says outwardly, this notion of Japan, what he believes Japan should be. So therefore he is in a time during the 50s and 60s, in particular the 60s, where you see a rise in the left. He is promoting the right and the far right, and so he becomes, in political circles, he comes from a very privileged background, and he's also a very famous writer. So this gives him certain relationships with people in government at the time, and which is, I would say, I'm not an expert in Japanese politics, but at the time it's you can probably describe it as being a right or center-right government. And then you have the rise in the left, especially with the student movements during the 1960s. And then you have Yukio Mishima coming in here. And also this is coming in also when you also have Japan, very broadly speaking, of course, Japan and its relationship with the United States that is ever evolving and becomes quite the focal point in many of these protests from the left. But also you have the Mishima coming in here, and instead of planting his flag in the left, which is probably what a lot of his contemporary authors did at the time, he planted his flag firmly into the right. And this leads to the events that populate the final years of his life. Namely, he basically he called it a private army, but he essentially formed this sort of cadre of young men, and he called it the Shield Society. And it was basically what he called a little army of men that had soldiers, but and they were training, and I think they also had access to government training grounds at some point. And but in any event, it was his way of presenting a further idea of his right-wing nationalism, and it went up all the way to 1970, November 1970, where he essentially committed a very public act of essentially he killed himself in a very startling fashion, and it's even to this day I'm just stunned whenever I just think about it. So and so that was his life, Mishima's life. And again, I'm not giving his life any justice here, because I don't. My point here is not to focus on Yukio Mishima, the figure and the author and the man and the public persona, but just to give a very brief background in Yukio Mishima, because this is the focus of the film, Mishima, Life in 4 Chapters. This is very important because we do see certain aspects of Mishima's life and works. Namely, we see the final day of his life as depicted in this film. We also see flashbacks to some parts of his earlier life, his childhood, when he was growing up, certain events as he was growing up that seemed to define who he later became. We also see adaptations of certain excerpts of novels, 3 novels in particular that he wrote that were selected with a certain purpose by the creators behind this film. Those works being The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, Kyoko's House, and Runaway Horses. So, and these are all novels. So, and this is all coming together in a film that is, I wouldn't call it a full-on biopic. I don't think a biopic is probably the best way to describe it, because a biopic seems to suggest a more or less standard, more or less linear progression from early beginnings to adolescence to formative years, and then to early adulthood, and then to later adulthood, or whatever. So there's a kind of progression, so to speak. This is not a biopic in that sense, I think. This is more of an impression of who Mishima was, or who Misha seemed to be. So this is the impression that is made. It's a film impression of an artist and a man who was many things to many people, and who later, or not later, who did many things that were quite shocking and provocative, and also was himself a very unique individual that to this day is in many respects still controversial, in Japan especially. So this is just a general imprint, I think, of what I think this film Mishima Life in 4 Chapters is, or is going to present to us as we go forward. So excuse me while I have a drink of water. Excuse me. So that is just a brief introduction, or introduction. So yes, so this film, let's go into this film proper. The film is directed by Paul Schrader, and this is very fascinating in itself. So it's directed by Paul Schrader. It's produced by Tom Luddy and Mata Yamamoto. And it's the executive producers are Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas, and we have it's credited as being written by Paul Schrader and Leonard Schrader. Although I think the supplements would also have Kyoko Schrader playing some role in the writing, although I don't know to what degree exactly in terms of a percentage, but still. And now, yes, in fact, the Japanese script is credited as being by Kyoko Schrader. So. This is a fascinating film in many ways. Oh, and I should mention the director of photography, John Bailey, and the music is composed by Philip Glass, and also we have production designer Eiko Ishioka, among others, on the cast and crew. So, and starring Ken Ogata as Yukio Mishima. This is a very, it feels, let's just get our general impressions about this film. This is a remarkable, beautiful, emotional, and odd film. I think it's a very bizarre film in many ways. And I think the general gist of why I think it's bizarre is it seems like it's pulling together so many different tones. We have the color aspect of the final day sequences, and these are this is the depiction of Mishima and the 3 other members of the Shield Society as they're going in and trying to break in, or not break in, but they go in and they essentially kidnap a senior ranking official with the SDF, and then they compel the garrison to assemble in front of the headquarters, and then so Mishima is giving his speech to them, and this then leads to his very very shocking seppuku suicide. So this is his last day in color, and it's shot in a sort of cinema verite approach. And then we have the the earlier sequences in black and white that focus on his childhood, in particular his, very briefly of course, his relationship with his mother, his grandmother, which were very important, his experiences, maybe one or maybe not fully, but some of his experiences as a young child during his school years. I think there were probably two or three key sequences actually when he was a child that are depicted here, when he was a young schoolboy. Namely, he had a certain run-in with schoolboys in the play yard, and they're playing on the fence, who's stronger, and that's suggestive of him as a weakling as a boy, and also he is depicted as having a little bit of a stutter, which then leads into the beginning of the sequence of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. As you know, the protagonist in that film and that story has a stutter, and it's the implication is that there's almost an autobiographical link that is being implied there. The other aspect of his schoolboy childhood that's depicted is his viewing of the picture of the Saint Sebastian, and his sexual arousal that occurs, or at least that he describes it as occurring. So, and the Saint Sebastian then comes in later, of course, when we see the grown Yukio Mishima, and he's now famous Yukio Mishima, and he's now becoming very strong physically in terms of his bodybuilding. And one of the pictures that he takes, or he has taken of himself, is in fact his posing in the same way and the same setup as that of the portrayal of Saint Sebastian. So these elements seem to suggest a kind of already elements that are going to play out in Mishima's life, which is the sort of the fixation with Western art, also the way he portrays sex and the way he feels about sex. Also, strength, weakness, physical strength, physical weakness, and self-expression through the stutter. And these are, of course, just, I think, seeds that are planted that'll grow later, as I've tried to suggest in a very vague detail, or in very vague terms here. But those are the childhood sequences. And then we also get other flashback sequences, or earlier sequences, shall we say, of his being a little bit older, maybe a college student, or a high school student, college student, something like that. And we see him failing his medical examination, which meant that he wasn't allowed to be enlisted in the army, which seems to be a very formative experience in his life, because the suggestion being that he was very proud of his samurai heritage, he was very proud of where he came from, but as we know, with the grown-up Mishima, he had a very strong fixation with the Japanese emperor, and also nationalism, and the emperor and the army. But the fact that he was not enlisted in the army when he was younger, and the implication in the film being that he had a cough when he was given his medical, when he was undergoing his medical examination. The implication in the film is that he might have been faking it. It's not quite clear, but he might have been faking it. And so, if that's the case, then that makes it even more fascinating, does it not? Because that means that there is an element from a certain point of view, there is an element of cowardice on his part, as in from a certain point of view. This is not a discussion about war and pacifism, but the idea being that for someone who seemed to be so vocal about the pride in the emperor system, and the notion of the rise of the army, if you will, as the focus of the right, for him to have not been enlisted in the war, in the army, excuse me, and the implication, or one of the interpretations, perhaps being that he might have actually faked it. Then that creates this huge, almost self-contradictory tension within him, which I think is so great when you then take that and look at the later part of the film through that lens, or through that lens among other lenses, shall I say. It's really great. That's really great, almost foreshadowing on the part of the filmmakers here. So, and then the other part of his sort of the late adolescence, early adulthood sequences before Yukio Mishima becomes Kenogata, shall we say? So the pre-Kenogata sequences. The other big aspect is his. When he tells his mother that he was rejected, or one of his stories was rejected from a publication, I think. So this seems to suggest a couple things already. He has a certain relationship with his mother, which is a little bit ambivalent. And when I say ambivalent, I don't mean anything. I don't mean to imply anything other than the fact that there's a certain complication that arises because his grandmother formed a very significant part of his early childhood. And according to the biography of Mishima, his grandmother, in essence, took him when he was a little child and basically made him stay with his grandmother, took him from his mother and made him stay with his grandmother. And so he wasn't allowed out when he was a very little boy, and he had to stay with his grandmother, which is in fact depicted in one of the earliest flashback sequences in the film, which I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, when he was a little boy and he's with his grandmother. And it's great because he is seen as a little boy from inside looking out through the window. And that's suggestive of the point of his life, that he wasn't allowed out for most of the time when he was with his grandmother. So he had to basically make do with being in the room or in the house with his grandmother. And also there was a bit of a domineering aspect to the grandmother character, as it's depicted in the film at least, saying that, please massage me or something, please look after me, you love me, don't you? So there is a little bit of a strong focus, almost a selfishness on the part of the grandmother, and also the inability of Yukio Mishima as a young boy to go out into the world, out into the sunlight, as it were. He had to stay in. And this is very formative because, according to his biography, he had to make do with the books that were in the house at the time. And many of the books that he was reading were Western fables and fairy tales. There's some account, which isn't, I don't think it's given in the supplements here in the Criterion Collection, but it was actually, I heard about it on television about Yukio Mishima here one day. That Mishima had to, one of the things he did to pass the time was he read the dictionary in Japanese. So he was reading the dictionary. And the point that was being made in the television program that I was watching was that the dictionary that he was reading was Japanese. And so this might have been one of the reasons why his use of Japanese later on in his life as an author was so striking and direct, because he tended to use phrases that weren't always employed in everyday Japanese language style, and put it that way. So sometimes his language style was very direct. It was also sometimes very intricate and loaded. And so I think the implication being that because he read the dictionary as a little boy, that might have informed how he used Japanese, at least as an author. But this is then, of course, so this sequence with the grandmother plays such significance as we go through the rest of the film. But now let's return to the mother-son relationship, because we do see certain sequences between mother and son, right? We see the sequence where they are taking the photograph together. And then we also see the sequence that I just referred to, which is Yukio Mishima essentially telling the mother that he was rejected again as a writer. So there is a kind of what I would say suggest between the mother, in these sequences between mother and son, are that it's unclear to me just what the degree of closeness is between the two of them, which is why I used the word ambivalent before. The relationship seems a bit ambivalent. It's not clear to me how close their relationship is. It might have been close, which is suggested of the fact, by the fact that Yukio Mishima, or Mishima at the time, tells his mother that maybe a somewhat intimate detail, namely that he was rejected again. But who knows? Maybe that's not even suggestive at that point at all. And there might be some distance between the two of them. Who knows? But there's a room for much interpretation there, which I think is great for a film. The other thing that comes up in that sequence is, of course, his ambitions as a writer. And he was rejected again. This is great, too, because he becomes a writer later, of course, and a very famous, celebrated writer, critically and also publicly, right? But this is great, too, because he was a rejected writer first, but then he became a celebrated writer later. So not only this is showing his aspirations of being a writer, but it's also, I think, suggestive of some kind of self-creation, creating oneself, molding oneself, using your will to become something that you want. At this point in his late adolescence, early adulthood, he was a failed writer. He then becomes a famous, successful writer later in his life. He essentially created himself into this famous, successful writer. And I think that is very significant if one takes that approach of interpretation, because that also suggests the fact that he created himself in not only the form of a writer, but also in many other ways, which we will see play out in quite striking and somewhat dramatic ways later on in the film. So those are the early sequences there. And then, so what was I talking about before? So I was talking about how there is differences in the film structure itself, and they seem to be disparate. So there were the last day sequences. There are the early sequences of his childhood and adolescence. Then there are also the early sequences prior to the last day of the grown-up Mishima and his early struggles as an emerging writer on the scene with Confessions of a Mask. There are, and he seemed to be maybe during his young adulthood, with the wonderful curl in his hair, and he's dancing somewhat. He's dancing somewhat slowly with one of the young men that he meets in a bar, in a dance club late night. We also see him looking through the window at a display of his work, Confessions of a Mask, as it was published for the first time in Japan. And all these things that are layered into the performance of Ken Ogata as the young adult Mishima. The implication here, of course, is that he is an emerging writer that is slowly finding success. There's also seemingly a sense of doubt in his face. There's also a sense of maybe frustration in the way things are going. This is also indicated by the fact that he's not pleased about his books not getting published in foreign languages and all the foreign languages that he wants, although he's getting all these national prizes in Japan for his works, and also he's been very prolific as an author. But also there's certain aspects of his sexuality, homosexuality, that I think are not directly made, but he does dance with a young man in a dance hall, and that's the scene where the young man says, kind of very playfully, innocently, but it really offends Mishima, which is, you're kind of flabby, And so that really shocks Mishima, right? And then that leads to this idea of the bodybuilding ethic. And he becomes this very intense bodybuilder. And then he becomes much more famous, and this leads to his more sequences involving his development in the right-wing nationalism movements, and then we go from there. So those are the early sequences of Mishima, and these are all in black and white. And then we have the three stories that are strategically placed in this film as the three depictions of the novels strategically placed, thus forming the core of the first three chapters, if you will, of this film: Temple of the Golden Pavilion, Kyoko's house, and Runaway Horses. And these are they're color, they're incredibly stylized. They each have their own cast, and so they feel almost like a mini film in many ways. And they speak to certain aspects of Mishima and his life, as we saw that progression in that very brief description of it that I just made. Beauty, art, and action. And then, so beauty being depicted through Temple of the Golden Pavilion, namely this idea of the acolyte at King Kakuji, and he is the stutterer, but he is fixated, almost unhealthily so, on this notion of the ultimate beauty, that is the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. And what he does to that, which is quite shocking, right? He is frustrated because he thinks that it's so beautiful that it must be destroyed, and so if it's not going to be destroyed by U.S. bombers during the war, then he has to take action into his own hands. At least that's the way he sees it. He tries to burn it down. Then we have Kyoko's house, which is a story about a young artist who is, I think, artistically not satisfied. He's trying to find ways to satisfy his yearning, his hunger. He can't find it through sex. He doesn't necessarily find it through art. He doesn't necessarily find it through bodybuilding. Well, I think he finds his answer in this very intense masochistic relationship, which leads to much violence. And so this idea that, art is art enough, or is there something that's needed in order to satisfy the artistic urge that was within the main character, the protagonist here, which is Osamu, right? And then we have the third sequence, which is Runaway Horses, which is action, which is about this this young, essentially a young student who creates this plan with a number of other students to try to effectively try to initiate a coup d'état, and that tries to play itself out in attempted assassinations of certain figures in Japanese government, which leads to one particular incident that occurs, and then the protagonist of the story, Isao, what he does in order to try to fulfill this plan of his, does this action, and what leads to that particular aspect, what happens to his character at the end, and then how that parallels what happens to Yukio Mishima at the end of his life. So, and these are very stylized. These are very odd. They are obviously filmed in a way that it makes obvious the point that they are like plays. They're filmed plays. We see certain aspects of how the set changes, and it feels like a stage. So these are they don't try to hide the fact that things are happening and moving, and costumes are being changed during one cut or during a single film sequence, etc. So this is very different from the cinema verite of The Last Day. This is very different from also kind of a documentary or faux documentary style of the earlier sequences, and it's bright colors, almost clashing colors, versus the straight-on color palette of the final sequence, or the black and white of the earlier sequences, and so these have different tones and elements here visually. And also, before I go to the comments here, let me say that the music, the Philip Glass score, also adds a certain, I think, I love Philip Glass, and this is such a great score because it's so weird, and it's so it's so apropos in many ways. I mean, and it goes totally against what one might consider to be what would be an appropriate score for a film like Mishima. It doesn't feel like a score that we've seen elsewhere. I mean, Philip Glass did Koyanis Katsi before this, but even this score, I would argue, Mishima feels much different from his earlier score, Koyanis Katsi. There is in other words, this adds a further element of disparateness and tension. So this film is, I think, filled with so many separate elements of tension that shouldn't seem to come together. On paper, they shouldn't. It feels like they can't succeed, right? But it does come together in this weird amalgam and odd way, and the way that's edited together, it also feels like it feels like it should be much messier than it is, right? But on the contrary, rather than it feeling messy upon one actually watching it, it feels actually, on the contrary, very elegant, very mysterious, and quite artistically put together. And it's put it together in a way that strikingly packs such an emotional punch by the film's end that when I finish the film, I am left breathless. And I marvel, every time I see this film, I marvel at the fact that there are so many weird, different elements here. And they're in the same film for 2 hours, and it feels like it shouldn't work, but it does. It really does. And so that is my very poor attempt at trying to synthesize in a very introductory way my feelings about Mishima before going into any further detail. But before I do, let me now go to the comments section here. So the live chat. So thank you very much for putting up with me for those first 45 minutes. But now let's go to the comment section, because I know that all of you will have many more and things to say, and say it much better than I. So anyway, let's go here. So Just Another God, you said you have to leave soon, but if you're still here, or if you see this later, hello. Cinema Dave Media, my dear friend, hello. Everyone, please, you probably know his channel already, but Cinema Dave Media's channel, his YouTube channel, is great. Subscribe to it and watch all the videos. He is really great. Nazarene Prot, hello, our dear friend, also wonderful, wonderful, wonderful channel. Gosh, so many people here. Great. Retro Player 72, my dear friend, hello. Paula, it's nice to see you. And Just Another God says, I like your shirt. Thank you. It's Greedo. And, oops, sorry. Okay, but let's go forward. JR62, hello again. Do you think the film might have been embellished? It's very artistic, you later say. Yes, and Wolfgrat says, I believe his widow was very, very peeved about the gay themes. And obviously it was extremely controversial politically. Yes, I will get into that in 1 second. This is, I think, about the production history. But yes, there is. It is remarked upon quite considerably in the supplements of the Criterion release that the widow, Madame Mishima, was apparently she was very concerned about two major aspects of the production. First being the depiction of Yukio Mishima and his homosexuality. The second being what she conceived, or what she thought to be, an overemphasis on the final day of his life. So these are the two aspects that, the two major aspects that she seemed to be displeased about. I mean, she apparently was very pleased at the beginning, at the outset, and so production commenced. But somewhere along the line, she soured on the production, at least according to the producers, especially Tom Luddy and Mata Yamamoto, and also Alan Pohl and Paul Schrader and Kyoko Schrader. So that's a lot of people who tend to have the same description of what happened. So, yes, so I think, but by that time, Oh, and also that probably prevented Paul Schrader from being able to use the novel that he had originally planned to use, which was Forbidden Colors. But so he was then forced to use another novel, which is Kyoko's House. And I did look this up, actually. This is something that I was confused about. Was it the fact that he had originally planned to use 4 novels, but he was then only permitted to use 3 of the 4, or was Kyoko's House a replacement for Forbidden Colors? Which, in other words, was he originally planning 3 novels to begin with, and just one of those 3 was replaced by Kyoko's House? And I understand it to be the latter, namely that he had originally planned 3 novels, one of which being Forbidden Colors, but since he couldn't get permission to use that, he then relied upon Kyoko's House. So. But we'll get into that hopefully later if we have time. Okay, so genealogy, MAD, MAD, greetings from Canada, hello. Let's see. Paul says, has anyone read Mishima's novels? I haven't, and I'm sure it would bring even greater understanding to the film. Obviously, he was a very complex man. Yes. If you're looking for a novel or some works to read, I would suggest reading, I think, 2, Confessions of a Mask and The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Confessions of a Mask is his first major work, and it's so essential. And I think I might have gotten this detail wrong in my earlier videos on Mishima, and I should correct the record now. But Confessions of the Mask is a very key work. It's probably his most key work, in my opinion. And I think if you're going to read one work, if you want to get an understanding of Mishima, who he was, and also if you want to have another aspect of Mishima when you watch this film, Confessions of the Mask is the way to go. I think we should be very clear here. The script was written with flashbacks and also with voiceover narration, which is by Mishima. And all those voiceover narration, the narration is based on writings by Mishima. So these are all essentially Mishima's words. But while the themes and the tones and the topics that are touched upon in those flashback narration sequences have to do in many respects with the themes and topics that are discussed in Confessions of a Mask, the work Confessions of a Mask was not directly relied upon with respect to the script for the narration portions of this film. That is very clear. That is very clearly set forth by Alan Poole in the commentary. And the reason that Alan Poole gives in the commentary is that the work's confession, the work's Confession of the there is the estate of Mishima, Yukio Mishima, that is controlled by Madame Mishima, the wife of Yukio Mishima, the widow. So those works and that estate was the estate with which the film production was dealing with. The 2 works, however, that were outside of that estate were bequeathed to Yukio Mishima's mother. Those 2 works are Confessions of a Mask and, I believe, The Sound of Waves. So those are essentially, what that means essentially is that you're dealing with different rights holders. So they couldn't secure the rights for Confessions of a Mask because you're dealing with different rights holders. But you could deal with other works that were within the estate that was, I guess, controlled by the widow. And I think one of the works within that was the work Sun and Steel. So the work Sun and Steel is also relied upon very heavily. And it's not a novel per se, but it's more like an essay of what he thought about. And I would also suggest perhaps reading Sun and Steel. It's very short. It's a little bit hard to read, actually. It's hard to get into, but I would suggest reading Confessions of a Mask first, because in fact, I think Confessions of a Mask is the very heart and soul of Mishima, the writer, and I think that very heart and soul, while not necessarily in the same words as Confession of a Mask, are definitely paralleled in this film. So there's Confessions of a Mask. That's very important. Sun and Steel, which I just referred to, is the work that I think was directly relied upon in many of the sequences here, the narration sequences. In particular, the key sequence, the key narration, I think, for me, that is borrowed by Sun and Steel is used at the very end in the F1 jet, right? So this is the sequence in black and white that is cut into that whole bit at the end where he is addressing the garrison, giving his final speech, and it's suddenly, and he's saying, are you not men? And then suddenly it cuts to the black and white sequence of him in an airfield, getting into dressed up as a pilot, getting into a plane and flying, right? And this idea that the narration being, and I'm paraphrasing here, which is the idea that, the two concepts in his mind that are just as important to him, but were irreconcilable up to now, were art and action, right? Action never seemed to go that extra step of fulfilling his artistic wants. And art, while beautiful and fulfilling in many respects, never went that extra distance in solidifying a kind of permanence that action had. So you had these two key concepts that were up to then irreconcilable, art and action. In Sun and Steel, he gives a sequence where he gives this discussion about the F1 jet and flying through the sky and seeing the sun. This is the epiphany that is depicted in the film. This is the epiphany, and the epiphany is so key. The reconciliation between these otherwise irreconcilable concepts in Mishima's mind, art and action, and the way that he realizes in this epiphany how to reconcile the two is, as he says, the only way that he can see to reconcile the two is through death. Wow, right? So, and then at that point, right, at that point in the film, the black and white image of the sun through the viewpoint of the cockpit of the jet, through Mishima's viewpoint as he's flying, black and white, suddenly merges into color, right? This is the key point, because this is where everything merges into one. Past and present come together. Art and action come together. Mishima as a man and author come together at this point, this key epiphany. And, right, in fact, at this very point in the film, art and action do come together for Mishima, because this is the point where he then kills himself. And it is at this point that the narration is basing itself on the work Sun and Steel, or a certain excerpt of Sun and Steel. So in that respect, I would say Sun and Steel is very important to read. But I would suggest reading it maybe sequentially after Confessions of a Mask. And so, yes, and it's not a novel per se. Confessions of a Mask is kind of a novel. It's also considered somewhat autobiographical. John Nathan describes it as being an autobiographical novel. It feels almost like an I novel, if you know that genre of literature, an I novel, although Mishima himself, in his interview, in his French interview, he said he was not a member of the school of the I novel, although the fact that he wrote Confessions of a Mask would seem to contradict that point. So again, it just leads off into all these contradictions about Mishima, which is fascinating. So, and then also, Paula, just to round out my response to your comment, Temple of the Golden Pavilion, I would also recommend. That is a novel, and it's considered by many, myself included, to be perhaps his greatest novel. I admit I'm not the biggest fan of Mishima, the author. I have certain issues with his writing, but I do admire the Temple of the Golden Pavilion very much. I do admire that work. And just if you're interested, I also like the work Spring Snow, which is the first the first work in the tetralogy, the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, comprised of Spring Snow, Runaway Horses, which is the third of the sequences in this film, Temple of Dawn, and Decay of the Angel. And in fact, the fourth work, the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, the fourth Decay of the Angel, which I've just mentioned, was in fact finished on the day that he died. And in fact, we see, I think, the manuscript, the finished manuscript of Decay of the Angel at the very beginning of the film, right? Because remember, he has an envelope and he says for the publisher. And the idea, I think, is that that is included in that, among other things, perhaps, is the finished manuscript for Decay of the Angel. So very interesting. But anyway, sorry about that. I hope that answers your question, Paula. And anyway, Jared, I never actually heard of this man before watching this film. I looked him up after watching this film, however. And Cinema Dave Media also mentions the novels. Wolfgrat says, I think a knowledge of the works would have been a very, very useful scaffolding for the film. Sadly, I haven't that knowledge, although I knew a bit about the god. You know, that's a really good point. I think it's not necessary. And I think I tried to make this point, or I tried to emphasize this point in an earlier video. I really believe that the works, you don't have to know the works necessarily. They would certainly help, most certainly help, but you don't necessarily have to have read the works to be able to appreciate this film, in my opinion. And I think I can give a concrete example. Kyoko's House, which is the second of the three literary works, excerpts, adaptations that are included in this film, which is in the, the second chapter of Art, I think. The work Kyoko's House is, I understand it, not actually made available at this point in time in an official English translation. For whatever reason, probably something to do with rights, I don't know. But for whatever reason, Kyoko's House is not made available in an official translation. I think you can find a translation floating around there somewhere, I don't know, just take a look. But so it's not available, but still, I think for many, so therefore for many viewers outside of Japan, maybe very few, I can assume, had read Kyoko's House upon watching this film. And yet, I think, and I've read Kyoko's House in Japanese, and in many ways, I think it's Mishima's, it's one of his most complex works. Very, very fascinating work. Very tough, very, very tough indeed. And the excerpt actually takes one aspect, only one aspect of this very complicated work. But I would dare say that that's all you need. The script, the Leonard Schrader, Paul Schrader script, and the Chieko Schrader script really take the essence of that and apply the essence to the story of the film so well, right? And the key of that, the key point of that is, and it's depicted in that sequence, right? Which is an artist who finds he finds that art alone is not enough, right? It's not enough. Something more is needed in order to satiate his lust, whatever that is. It's not enough. And that's perfect, right? Because that goes into the whole hypothesis of the film. Art alone is not enough. Action alone is not enough. Therefore, at the point of epiphany, art and action merge that have otherwise been up to heretofore irreconcilable. This is showing, the Kyoko's House excerpt is showing this aspect of art not being enough. The only way that satisfies the protagonist in that excerpt, Osamu, is the getting into this very strange sadomasochistic relationship with this woman, which later leads to his death. Whether or not the character of Osamu, at least depicted in the excerpt here, was welcoming his death. Whether he was welcoming his death or not, I think is a vague, ambiguous point, which is left to the interpretation of the viewer. And I think one can fall either way. I mean, he was welcoming the masochistic elements of his relationship, which led to his being cut and injured. But whether or not he was welcoming his own death, that's another question. But I think the implication is that perhaps he might have been. And I think we can make that, that inferences can be made very reasonably by the very fact that this is what I think the hypothesis of the entire film is in the context of Yukio Mishima's life. So, in other words, I think all the elements for the understanding and appreciating Kyoko's house are all included within the context of the film. And so, and I think that's true also for the other sequences. And so I think one doesn't necessarily have to read the novels. But again, at the same time, I think reading novels will give one maybe potentially perhaps a potentially richer place and more room for exploration for all these themes and topics that are obviously related to the film Mishima. So anyway, let's see. Just I'm skipping over the comments here, some of the comments. So there you go. Oh, Melinda McClure, hello again. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you. As always, completely unnecessary, but the sentiment is so appreciated. Thank you so much, and I hope you're well, my dear friend. Itamar says, one thing I found so interesting is the way Schrader contrasts Mishima's rogue group with the actual army. The vigilantes are so unified and efficient, whereas the army seems disorganized. Okay, so I'm going to have to unpack this a little bit. So when you say rogue group, I'm assuming, and you say vigilantes, you're referring to the Shield Society. Okay, so I think I want to be absolutely clear here. The Shield Society that we see depicted in this was, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go so far to call it a rogue group, at least at the very beginning. It became a violent group at the end, of course, when it did what it did on November 25th, but or not what it did, but 4 members of that did what it did on November 25th. But the Shield Society up to then had been, and we see this depicted in the film, very well respected. It was very well respected by the media. It was very well respected by the Japanese government. And I understand, according to the supplements, that the Japanese government, the Ministry of Defense, even at the time, had permitted the Shield Society to have access, maybe albeit limited access, to certain government facilities and training grounds. And so this is really great. And this is one of the reasons why Mishima had such easy access with the Self-Defense Force headquarters on November 25th that day in the Ministry of Defense. So he had a very cordial relationship with certain members in government. And so it was a very well-respected group, which then on this day turned very violent. And so I would maybe footnote your comment if I were to make it myself and say that I would just emphasize that point because it was very well respected. And I think it probably is one of the sources of potential sources of embarrassment, as Alan Poole so astutely points out in the commentary. And I didn't realize this until the commentary, which was at the time of the Mishima incident, the Minister of Defense was Nakasone. And so Nakasone was then Prime Minister of Japan at the time the film was released in 1985. And so we have this little bit of perhaps embarrassment on the part of certain members of Japanese government. Namely, it was, this Mishima incident happened on the watch of the person that later became Prime Minister during the time that the film was released. So anyway, yes. And what you say about the Shield Society seemed so unified and efficient, whereas the army seems disorganized. I don't know I don't know what the basis is for the interpretation that the army is disorganized. Perhaps one might be referring to the fact that the garrison is being assembled at the end that morning when Mishima addresses them from the second story there. I don't know if they seem that, I don't know if I would call them disorganized in the sense. Of course, it was very last minute. I mean, they were suddenly assembled. I mean, no one had planned this. Obviously, this is suddenly a huge surprise, and they were expected to assemble because one of the senior officials was, in essence, being kidnapped. And so one of the demands of Mishima was to have the garrison assemble. Okay, and in fact, I love how Mishima, as he's waiting, he's looking out in the window, smoking a cigarette, and he says, "You know, our little drama has attracted quite an audience." So even there, he's acknowledging, tacitly acknowledging that this is in fact almost like a performance art drama. But that's another point. But yeah, so I don't know if I would call him disorganized, but there is a kind of last minute rush there. But when they start to react the way they do, and they're saying, you know, get off the stage, get out of there. I mean, they're booing him and they're rejecting him essentially. This is not so necessarily a reaction by the army per se, but it's just, you know, these men who are working in the army, and they're basically rejecting what Mishima is saying here, his calls for a coup d'état. So I wouldn't necessarily couch them in terms of organization and disorganization, but I mean, I think your approach is very sound and very interesting. So great comment. Thank you very much. Okay, so just skipping over here a few. Okay, so Itamar, then you're saying here, I specifically remember compositions of Mishima's men so symmetrical, everyone in perfect order with matching suits, whereas the army is shot from this high documentary-esque footage. So, okay, and then the way the army is set up looks so unorderly, where there is kind of this beautiful brotherhood between Mishima's men. It is as if Schrader knows Mishima's goal is futile and wrong. Certainly his methods are, but there is still something beautiful about the brotherhood and friendship. Okay, now I see what you're saying, Itamar. So, yes, so then you're talking about the depiction of the brotherhood among these certain members of the Shield Society. In particular, these four. And so, yes, I mean, you know, we do get some... I mean, we see them having a blood oath, right? We also see Mishima and Morita, discussing who they should recruit for this final mission, so to speak. And, you know, during the time when they were supposed to see Mount Fuji, but, you know, they can't see Mount Fuji in all this fog, right? But, and we do see this strong bond depicted between the men, in particular Morita and Mishima, during those final moments on the final day, especially between those two, because their relationship was very significant. Also by the fact that Morita was supposed to chop Mishima's head off as part of the seppuku ritual. Yeah, so there is a certain depiction of orderliness, right? But the film ends at a way where we don't see the aftermath of what happens to that orderliness, and in fact, it becomes chaos. It becomes absolute chaos at the end there, at least as we know from history. So, but in terms of the film, I think you're right in terms of the depiction. So very well put. So thank you very much for that. Let's see. So just scrolling down the comments here, give me one moment here, and if I'm and there's a great discussion here, right, about this. Yes, and there's a further discussion. Everyone here is very helpful about suggestions about what to read, works by Mishima. This is great, wonderful. And Paul Emery says, I love the film's presentation of a complicated life in complicated terms. Very well put. I like that. The theatrical presentation of his writings was very effective. Yes. Jacob J. says, I was always sort of confused by the Temple of the Golden Pavilion and how it tied into the themes of the movie. Okay, that's a good question, right? It's set up as being the hallmark or the center point of the chapter, the first chapter called, is it Beauty? And I think, well, that's probably a good way to segue into what I want to talk about next, which is actually those sequences. So how they tie in. I tried to touch on this before. So Jacob J. this is great. Thank you very much for your question. Let me just use this as a springboard off of what I was going to plan to say next, which was, okay, So I think this is very clear. Well, not clear, but this is very important to make out. At least for me, I think it's very important. Um, okay, so we have the Temple of the Gold. Okay, Temple of the Golden Pavilion, in very broad terms, is beauty. So what does that mean, beauty? In the context of the story as it's depicted in the film, the acolyte finds the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji, which is in Kyoto, which is a real place, so beautiful for whatever reason, in terms of its architecture, in terms of its construction, the materials, the way it's constructed, the way it's depicted in the natural setting, what it represents, not only in visual terms but also spiritual terms. So it all encompasses this notion of beauty. It's the most beautiful thing to him. But things that are so beautiful, cannot be allowed to exist. They must be destroyed. And there is this, entered into that, there is this idea of a kind of sadist aspect, which is then enmeshed in a masochist aspect, a sadomasochist aspect, and almost a kind of what happens to the acolyte at the end. And he's trying not only to right, burn down the place, but also, in a sense, the implication at the end of the final shot, one of the final shots of the film, is that he wants to burn down himself. And so that, I think, allows for the element of masochism to come in, although not as strong as the sadist aspect, I would argue. But the point is that here, I think, the point of the inclusion of this work is that beauty is something that is so beautiful that it must be destroyed. Thus, this introduces the element of sadism. And thus, this introduces the idea of the destruction of something beautiful. If we apply that to Mishima's life and his thinking, in very, let's say, maybe superficial terms, perhaps, he builds himself up as a bodybuilder. He is a glorified writer. He is famous. He has wealth, fame, celebrity. So he is also respected as an intellectual, a great writer. So everything is perfect or beautiful, both physically, financially, and also in terms of his reputation. At the point in time where he is at his most beautiful, he destroys himself. So I mean, and if that is if that is a kind of a statement in terms of his own self-worth, or what might perceive to be his own self-worth and his own sort of narcissism, perhaps, then I think that's a very reasonable proposition to make. In any event, I think that's one of the key aspects of how one of the fundamental, it's not the only one, but it's one of the fundamental aspects in how I think we can find a connection between the Temple of the Golden Pavilion and how it ties into the film. Okay. Kyoko's house is Kyoko's house, I think, is significant in many ways, but one of the fundamental ways, I think, is that, okay, so we have this idea, not necessarily of beauty. We're now talking about the importance of art, and art as depicted in Kyoko's house is theater, plays, and the like, right? But we never see art in terms of how it's created, but we see art in terms of its effect, and also well, actually, no, I take that back. We do see maybe some aspects of the creative aspect of art, and it is distinct, although very closely related to beauty, right? This idea of creating something that is for some kind of other level, right? Something that is beyond oneself, but then trying to merge it with oneself. So, but for Osamu, this idea of trying to find something else beyond him that will satisfy him, whether it's art or whether it's his own exercise and bodybuilding, isn't ultimately satisfying to him. what's satisfying, what he needs in order to find further satisfaction, whether it's couched in sexual satisfaction or gratification, or whether it's something intellectual, or maybe it's something for him maybe much more fundamental to his own heart and soul, who knows. What he needs is something that he gets in this masochistic relationship where he becomes injured. Or not only that, he becomes under the control of this woman because of the financial dire straits of Osamu's mother. So there is a certain aspect of control over his life and his actions, which then leads to control over his physical body, which then ultimately leads to control over his very life, which leads to his own death. So this is what he needs to get a thrill, essentially. Art alone is not enough for him. He needs something more. And for Osamu, that something more is coming to fruition in this relationship, which is it leads to physical scarring, and it leads to pain, and all that implies. And so I think we can tie this into the story of Mishima as it's depicted here, which is that for Mishima, at least the outward, his persona would have us believe that he needed something more than just his art. His art was not enough. Right? His final act, in many respects, can be seen to be the ultimate performance art, and he took the one extra step, right, which is he killed himself. Now, I think this is very significant because, and this is the way for me to best understand the idea of reconciling the concept of art and action, which have been up to now irreconcilable. And what do I mean by that? I mean that any artist, at least in the terms that Mishima seems to view them, any artist can make a work of art. Any artist can express himself or herself. But and these are usually based on a good artist will probably base these on some kind of principle, right? Something that he or she wants to depict, some kind of principle that he or she wants to somehow capture. The idea, therefore, is how far an artist is willing to go for the sake of his or her own principles that he or she seems to otherwise espouse when he or she makes art or talks about his or her own art. Right? And this is a kind of dilemma that we see in everyday lives, right? How far is someone willing to go in order to prove how much he or she is devoted to a principle? I think for Mishima, this idea of art and action reconciling is very important because for him, the answer was to show the ultimate devotion to one's principle is to kill oneself. In other words, his suicide was the ultimate expression of how far he was willing to go. And he was willing to go very far. I don't think anyone can deny the fact that he went the distance. And in fact, this is so wonderfully captured in an anecdote that was given in one of the supplements about the early casting of Mishima, the role of Mishima. Before Ken Ogata was eventually cast, I think one of the actors that had been considered for the role, who's a young actor at the time, but I think the story goes that he was a student growing up during the time of Mishima, and he was on the left, and so he was, I think, diametrically opposed to the politics that Mishima seemed to be espousing outwardly anyway. So I think one of the reasons why this young actor decided to decline was because he felt that he wasn't appropriately devoted to Mishima enough to be able to depict him appropriately in the film, and so he was not that. But I think it was described that he expressed almost remorse and regret, perhaps, that Mishima seemed to go far, and in many respects farther than any of his contemporaries on the left. And so that suggests to me that the very act of his committing suicide is his ultimate expression of how far he was willing to go. And it was that extra step of his own suicide that I think is at play in Kyoko's house, with Osamu, the extra step that he wanted in order to get something more than what was just art, you know. So I think that's how Kyoko's house is significant, or one of the ways anyway. Then, as for Runaway Horses, this idea of political action taken on the part of people who are essentially outside of political power, but who feel like they are representing an ideal or principles that are greater than themselves. And the way in which action is it's initiated. It's through an idea, it's through planning, and it's through execution. And so we see this, and then so this is the playing out, and this is in the context also of a right-wing nationalism that is at the very fore of where Mishima was at the very point of his death. And the way in which Isao, the protagonist of the Runaway Horses, carries out his plan, and at the very end by himself, and what that leads to, which is, of course, his own ritual seppuku suicide. This mirrors exactly what happens to Mishima, and it mirrors exactly where Mishima, at least according to him, expressed his own political views. And so I think Runaway Horses and the connection is very strong and startling. So hopefully, I hope that answers your question. Oh, and I should say also before I go which is, it's very interesting to see the parallels and also the differences. So we look at the three protagonists in each of these works, right? We don't know what happens, at least as depicted at the end of Temple of the Golden Pavilion. But the protagonist there, at least when the film ends, he is still left alive. After the film, we don't know what's going to happen, at least depicted in the film, but he's still left alive, although he has committed an act against something outside of himself, namely the temple. For Kyoko's house, the protagonist is seen lying down on the ground, tied up, and the assumption being that he's dead, along with the woman. And so the assumption being that he was killed by the woman, or maybe he allowed himself to be killed. It wasn't necessarily, the assumption being, I think, that it wasn't a direct act of suicide, although it could have been. We're not quite sure. There's still a lot of ambivalence there. But and we're not sure exactly whether he was welcoming his own death or not. He might have welcomed any acts of masochism on vis-a-vis against himself, but we're not sure about his own death, although there's room for interpretation there. But it is very clear that the protagonist of Runaway Horses not only commits an act against someone outside of himself, but also he commits the act directly to himself. And so I think there is an interesting progression, or maybe parallel and differences, shall we say, among these protagonists. And each of them, although they end up arguably in different places by the end of their respective stories, still lends a great deal of relevance to the overall story of Yukio Mishima as depicted in the film. Okay, so there we go. Now let's return to the comments here. So Brandon says, I was entirely confused when I was originally watching the film, yet once I read Confessions of a Mask and Temple of the Golden Pavilion, it helped make sense of what was happening. Okay, so that's really good. So maybe that is an argument to say that perhaps it would be better to read the books first. Brandon, thank you very much. That's great. That's absolutely great. And I think that's great. If one wants to go and read the books first, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, just skipping out the... just going through the comments here. Sorry if I'm skipping out this, skipping your comments here. So Nazarene Prod says, Schrader never does normal biopics. He keeps the important and scraggly, difficult parts of their lives and forms everything around that using elaborate structures. That's a very good point about Paul Schrader. I would say also that Paul Schrader is the director here, and he does some fantastic work. It's amazing, and I should say also that much credit should be given also to Mata Yamamoto and Tom Luddy on the producer side, Leonard Schrader, his late brother, Chieko Schrader, and also and also Alan Poole in particular. I mean, those Chieko Schrader and Alan Poole in particular have a very significant role in the production of the film, as we can see, and in the supplements, because they formed they were the people who were at the center. They were almost the liaisons, if you will, between the Japanese crew and the Western crew. And so because they not only could they both speak English and Japanese, but they also both had a really great, keen understanding and insight of both cultures. And in this film, in the production of the film, which is fascinating, absolutely fascinating, you're getting a real clash. Not only are you getting a clash of I hate this phrase, but for lack of a better phrase, not only are you getting this mix of East versus West, but you're also getting you're getting this in the context of one of the most controversial figures in modern Japanese society, Yukio Mishima. My goodness, this is a huge pit of volatility, explosions just waiting to happen. And the fact that the film turned out as beautifully as it did, is, I think, a miracle. Absolutely miracle. So just to give you some examples, and if you're interested in further research, there's no better place to start than the Criterion Collection supplements, because they go into these very, very nicely. In particular, this commentary, and in particular, the audio interview with Kyoko Schrader. Very, very important. And also the essay here, the two essays here, but in particular the essay called Banned in Japan. Although I love the essay, although I don't really like that title very much. But you can get a real nice taste of this, which is, okay. So they had to deal with the widow, Madame Mishima. And at first they seemed to placate or they seemed to assuage Madame Mishima's early concerns, and so they were allowed to make the film. But then later on, or during the production, a certain attitude shift occurred, and this very likely caused the executives at Toho to get cold feet and decide not to release the film. And I think part of this had to do also with the fact that the right-wing groups, the very vocal right-wing groups, the ultra-nationalistic right-wing groups, who obviously had a very great devotion to the myth of Yukio Mishima, to the legacy of Yukio Mishima, probably the implication being is maybe they got wind of the displeasure or the dissatisfaction on the part of Mishima's widow with respect to how this film would be depicting Mishima. And so, according to Mata Yamamoto, who is one of the producers here, his life was threatened. He felt like his life was being threatened. There were certain disruptions in terms of production. These groups can be very vocal, and so maybe there were some attempts at trying to disrupt production. And also this probably gave a lot of people cold feet, because this could have caused a bit of a firestorm had the film been officially released in Japan. And as I mentioned at the very outset of this live stream, this film has never been given an official release in Japan. And that is, it's not because it's banned. It's not a banned film. It's not a film that has, it's not a film that has been given a governmental ban by the government. It's a film where the studio or the private company persons in control of the decision making regarding distribution of the film, for whatever reason, their decision was made not to release the film in Japan. So, and the implication or the likelihood is that this is probably to do, or one of the reasons was perhaps, not only was Mishima a very controversial figure even in 1985, but also the fact that perhaps there was pressure on the part of what they perceived to be pressure from the right, or certain factions of the right, shall we say. And also there was pressure from the Mishima estate, at least from the widow. So there was all that. So this is very potentially quite volatile. But the fact that the film is made is, I think, a miracle in and of itself. Now, I should say something about Paul Schrader and the filmmaking here. I mean, like I say, this is such a fascinating production history in so many ways. I mean, according to Kyoko Schrader, the right Paul Schrader and Leonard Schrader were not on their relationship was not so good around the time that they started making this film, and even during the process, there were a lot of fights between the two of them. So there is a fascinating story right there, the relationship between the brothers. But that relationship created this film, which is, in many ways, I think Paul Schrader's greatest film. Yeah, I think it is Paul Schrader's greatest film in my opinion. But also Paul Schrader, it's amazing. When we listen to him on the commentary, I mean, he himself admits he doesn't necessarily have the greatest expertise when it comes to Japanese culture and Japanese history. He has a great admiration for culture and art, of course, but when it comes to the actual specific not requirements, but the specific nuances and understandings of Japanese culture and how to deal with the Japanese crew and cast, he had no understanding, or not no understanding, but he had relatively little understanding of that. The people who had the best understanding of this are Kyoko Schrader and Alan Poole. And to hear them speak on the supplements is fascinating. And then to hear Paul Schrader, therefore, speak with him, so fascinating. Alan Poole in particular. I mean, he was he graduated, and he graduated with I think a degree in Japanese studies, Japanese literature, I think, and he spoke Japanese perfectly, and so he was, and in fact, I think he appears in the film himself. He is the lone non-Japanese reporter that asks a question at the press conference of Mishima, and after the film Patriotism, right? So he has the glasses, and in fact, in the commentary, he sort of begrudges the fact that he was allowed to do that thing with his glasses. He pushes his glasses up to the top, part of his nose like that. So, and they're laughing about that. It's really great. So. That commentary is so wonderful, but I love that commentary because it's very poignant. On the one hand, the commentary, I think, according to Paul Schrader, it was recorded 2 weeks after Paul Schrader's brother had died, and so it's really, that's really stunning, that timing. But also, we also get information about how Paul Schrader wanted to do some fixing of the color coordination of certain aspects of the scenes, especially with the runaway horses sequences. And so I think there are certain color differences that occurred with the Criterion Collection release, which is fascinating. And also, I love how they're giving so much information about the production in Japan and Mishima and all that, but they still have time for quips and humor, which is great. I think at the scene at the very end where they're talking, where Ogata is about to perform the ritual suicide as Mishima at the very end there, and then we see the close-ups of his chest and his lower torso. The two of them, Alan Poole and Paul Schrader, are just kind of joking about how it's so obvious that his body hair is fake. I don't know. It's a really interesting timing for that particular comment, I suppose. But anyway, so getting a little bit off topic there. So my point is that Alan Poole and Kyoko Schrader have this real keen understanding of Japanese culture and nuances. Paul Schrader is the director, and he's a co-writer, and he's bringing the creative force behind this. So those elements are there. And I think also it cannot be overstated the influence of Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas at this time, who are huge heavyweights. And that had a lot to do with being able to convince many of the people at the very outset who needed to be convinced before this film was made. Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas are behind this, and so this will help. And in fact, George Lucas's involvement was very important because this convinced Warner Brothers to come into the game, right? So this is very important also. Although the fact that Warner Brothers was not involved in the Japanese side of distribution meant that the film ultimately was subject to the decision for it not to have been released in Japan. I think had Warner Brothers had control of the Japanese side of that as well, it would have been released in Japan. At least that's the speculation by Tom Luddy. So yes, so we have all this stuff that's going on, but the creative forces, I would admit, also include Leonard Schrader, Chieko Schrader, Alan Poole. Their contributions cannot be emphasized enough, in my opinion. And of course, at the head of that, or at the central focus of that, is Paul Schrader. And Paul Schrader again has a remarkable. I mean, there are two instances in the commentary Paul Schrader gives. It's remarkable. I was stunned when I heard them, actually. So there are two instances. So the first example, there's a scene in the film where Mishima is shown alone in his home, which is a room, which is like a tatami room, like a dojo, and he's dressed in white, and he is doing the sword play exercise ritual with the sword, and it's a real sword, at least. I mean, I don't know if it was a real sword for the purposes of the production, but right. So he's doing this, right. And this is interesting because Ken Ogata, as an actor, I think many people in the crew, Japanese crew in particular, and even Paul Schrader, probably weren't necessarily convinced that Ogata could pull it off, because the idea being that I think while Mishima as a figure was he was considered to be in the aristocracy class, or the upper class. Ken Ogata as an actor was depicting a lot of working class characters in much of his career. So he's considered a lower working class character actor. And so how could a character actor of working class depict Yukio Mishima, who is of the aristocracy class, or the sort of quasi-aristocracy class, perhaps. But then when he was performing the scene, which I think was done in one take, it's so beautiful, and it's poetic and elegant and very technically difficult. I'm not a swordsman, but it's so difficult because of the weight of the sword and the length of the sword, and also the danger. One needs to be very careful with one's swings and thrusts, and also not only to be able to do that, but to do that with grace and beauty and perfect timing and balance. But he pulled it off, and according to Alan Poole, he was rehearsing, he was practicing. Ken Ogata was practicing that every day for months, trying to get that right. And when he did that, and he performed it to perfection, which we see in the film, at the end of that take, the Japanese crew just stood there and applauded him. They applauded him. And according to Alan Poole, who I think had his finger on the pulse of the Japanese thinking at the time, according to Alan Poole, he said that this was an indication of the crew finally accepting Ken Ogata as Yukio Mishima, because he performed this scene to perfection, and that's why they were applauding. And it was a beautiful moment, and I think hearing that story, that's very touching. But then when Paul Schrader mentions that same story, or he reacts to that, he says, "Oh, I didn't know that was the reason why they were applauding. I thought they were just applauding because he was able to finish the scene in one take or something. I didn't realize that." So it's wonderful to see this difference in view as to what this moment actually meant. I would prefer to side with how Alan Poole seemed to see it. And if that's the case, it's fascinating to know that Paul Schrader had a different take on it. And of course, Paul Schrader himself admits that he didn't necessarily have his finger on the pulse of what the Japanese crew were necessarily thinking. So this is nothing against Paul Schrader, which is why I think it was great that he was able to come together with Alan Poole and Leonard Schrader and Chieko Schrader to begin with. Right? Leonard Schrader, of course, had with Chieko Schrader already had experience with scripts, right? Many of his scripts or many of his writings were with Japanese films. I mean, just look at Leonard Schrader's career. Look it up on Wikipedia. Look at some of the films that he has credited as writing, and he's already having influence with certain films that deal with Japan. So, and of course, Kyoko Schrader's influence cannot be overstated enough. You have to listen to that interview. You have to listen to that interview with Kyoko Schrader, by the way. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. But to go back to Paul Schrader for a minute. Okay, so we have all these elements coming together that I think help the overall production and help the influence of the overall production in the eyes of the Japanese side of things. Right? But it is still curious, very curious. Paul Schrader, right? If you're thinking about, okay, who's going to make a film about Mishima? The last person that would probably be on that list, if it's going to be on that list at all, is Paul Schrader. You wouldn't think that Paul Schrader would make a film about Mishima. You'd think maybe a Japanese director would probably make a film about Mishima, right? And I've heard from other people, other friends of mine online, Facebook, saying, I've heard the criticism that, Paul Schrader wasn't the most appropriate director to make Mishima. Perhaps the more appropriate director would have been, this is 1985, so maybe it could have been someone like, I don't know, like Imamura or maybe even Oshima, Nagisa Oshima perhaps. And in fact, actually, I don't know if you know it, but very recently, a few years ago, and the filmmaker Koji Wakamatsu actually made a film about Yukio Mishima and actually depicted the final moments of Yukio Mishima's life and the Shield Society and all that, starring the same actor who was the main actor, the starring actor in the Hirokazu Koreeda film Afterlife called Arata, if you're interested. But anyway, Wakamatsu made a film about Mishima a few years back, which I would say is I love Wakamatsu's films very much, but I think it's a minor work from Wakamatsu. But going back to Paul Schrader, I think Paul Schrader was perhaps the perfect choice for making this film Mishima, because he was an outsider. He came from the outside. He came from North America. He came from America. And so Yukio Mishima had reputation and fame outside of Japan. And in fact, to make this film in Japan would have been impossible. It would have been impossible because the powers that be in Japan, and we can infer this from how they reacted to the proposals from the Schrader side and from the Zoetrope Studios side, we can see that they would have certainly not agreed to make this film had it been a wholly 100% Japanese production. Okay, and that's because of the pressure from the Mishima state. That's because of the other political related concerns, perhaps. And so the fact that Paul Schrader came in with the support of many people, included in which, of course, was Coppola and Lucas, which I think is very significant. That was very important in one of the components of the story behind how this film eventually got made. Okay. But also his sensibilities, right? It's very famous that Paul Schrader is, he said, had Mishima not been a real life person, I would have invented him, or something like that. And I think what he means by that is that his character, his character's Travis Bickle, as an example, in his screenplay for Taxi Driver, is very much like Mishima, right? In terms of a kind of search for something beyond oneself, and this idea of creation of the self, and the creation of the self in the context of what ultimately the character chooses, which is the road of violence and also self-destruction, and amongst other things, of course. And so, and I think this also brought a lot of cachet among the Japanese crew, at least according to Kyoko Schrader. This was Paul Schrader, the writer of Taxi Driver, so that had a lot of cachet, and people were listening to that on the Japanese crew. So, and this is also very interesting as well, because while there was a lot of protest against certain aspects of the film from certain pockets of the right, they were mainly directed towards the Japanese producer, Mata Yamamoto. They weren't necessarily directed towards Paul Schrader. And I think, according to Paul Schrader, this was because, Mata Yamamoto is Japanese, and so perhaps it was that he was seen as because he was Japanese, he should have known better, or he should know better than to be involved directly in the making of this kind of film about Yukio Mishima. Whereas Paul Schrader was an outsider, or he was a foreigner, so therefore he probably he can be allowed to go through with this, or something to that effect. And these aren't my words, of course. These are just what is being suggested, and what has been suggested, as at least as told by the participants in many of the interviews and the supplements here. So the point here is that this film most likely could never have been made in Japan under 100% Japanese production. So it could only have been made in this outside non-Japanese production or co-production situation, okay, with the clout that George Lucas and Coppola and Paul Schrader brought to the table. Also, in terms of artistic sensibilities, right, there's a connection between Travis Bickle and Yukio Mishima as a kind of example for that. I think also lends itself very nicely to the proposition that in many ways Paul Schrader was the ideal choice. He was the ideal choice for the director of this film, Mishima, and the co-writer of this film, Mishima. Undoubtedly, he was. But in many ways, he was, and he admits this too, he was inexperienced when it came to specifics of Japanese culture and Japanese society, which is why he very openly and very rightly relied on many members of his close circle of crew, in particular Alan Poole and Chieko Schrader. So it's great. And this is also recited very nicely in the anecdote that that Chieko Schrader gives in her audio interview about the actor Sachiko Hidari, who is the mother of Osamu in the sequence Kyoko's house. Now, she is a very, very famous actor in Japan at the time, and she was actually also a director. And so a very strong pedigree and very strong history and connections in Japanese cinema. But for the sequences involving her and also involving Sawada, Julie, the actor who played Osamu, the arrangement was that Chieko Schrader, not Paul Schrader, but Chieko Schrader would be directing them directly because Paul Schrader couldn't speak Japanese. Chieko Schrader could speak Japanese and English. And so she would be directing the two actors directly. It wouldn't be Paul Schrader. And that was the arrangement. For Sawada, this is okay. But for Sachiko Hidari, apparently, this is not okay. And she was very angry. And she was saying, according to Chieko Schrader, she was saying, I want to be directed by Paul Schrader. I don't want to be directed by this young, inexperienced, person. Who is this person? And she didn't know who Chieko Schrader was. Ultimately, Sachiko Hidari was convinced that, in fact, it was probably better for that Chieko Schrader direct her, and that's what eventually happened, and that's how the anecdote ends. But the point is that Paul Schrader had this reputation, or he had this reputation at the time, not only as a director of the film, but also as a very great director and a very famous one. And so I think that is suggestive, again, of the fact that he had a lot of clout, artistically speaking. I should say also, as a kind of closing anecdote here, I did hear a friend of mine say, gosh, it would have been better had Oshima direct this film. I disagree with that. I respect that opinion, of course, but I have to disagree with that with respect, of course. And the reason why I disagree is that Oshima was very evidently an artist who planted his political leanings flag very confidently in the left. Mishima was, of course, planted his flag in the right. Of course, there's nothing on paper that would prevent anyone who has different political views to direct a film that is about a person who has different political views than one's. Of course, that can happen, but I think there is something that can be said for the fact of Paul Schrader's somewhat apolitical stance when it comes to Japanese politics versus someone else like Oshima, who had a very strong political viewpoint. This is very clear in his early works. This is very clear in his interviews, and it's very clear in the way he carried himself, especially in the 60s. So I don't know that Oshima would have been the quote-unquote appropriate director for this film. And I can also make that inference maybe secondarily perhaps by the fact that, again, Wakamatsu, as I mentioned, made a film, and Wakamatsu passed away, unfortunately, but before he died, one of the last films he made was a film, in fact, about Yukio Mishima. And I would argue that the film is somewhat, it's somewhat problematic, and there are certain artistic issues that I have with it. And, you know, the Wakamatsu and Mishima, I think, it can be said that they were definitely on opposite ends of the political spectrum in terms of their political viewpoints. And so I'm not saying that it's 100% indicative of this, but it probably might be some kind of indication of how significant the fact of Paul Schrader's apolitical stance in terms of Japanese politics really was in the context of creating this film Mishima. So anyway, sorry about that, but let me now return to the comments because it is almost 8. Has it already been almost 2 hours? Gosh, I've been talking too much. I apologize. Let me now go here to the comment section and we will call it a day very soon. So again, I apologize if I'm skipping your comments. This is great. This is really great. Paula says, regarding the Philip Glass score, it truly is incredible. It propels the movie and accentuates Mishima's path every step of the way. In some ways, the score actually helped me find my groove with the film. That is a great point. The Philip Glass score is one of the great scores, in my opinion. It is, you know, Philip Glass at the time, he had done Koyanis Katsi. He was very famous for his portrait operas. The portrait operas, in other words, the operas that he made that focused on a particular individual or historical individual. So the 3 in particular that are very famous, Einstein on the Beach, Satyagraha, and Akhenaten. So in many ways, Philip Glass's work for Mishima is a continuation of that portrait opera approach. The score is very much a portrait of Mishima in musical terms. It's the same theme, but it's presented in different ways, and I love that. Right, the same theme is, just look at the difference in the way the theme is used in Temple of the Golden Pavilion, and then the way it's used in Kyoko's house with the twangy guitar, and the way it's used in Runaway Horses with that quick waltz tempo, right? So that's a great score. I love that score. It's wonderful. Just going here. Let's see. So I'm just scrolling through the comments in the live stream, which is great. Jared Wignall says, the more I think of this film, the more I want to know about Mishima. Well done. That's great. And JR62 says, as we speak, I just bought Mishima biography by John Nathan. Yes, John Nathan's biography is it's one of the landmark biographies on Mishima. Hayden, hello Hayden, you say, this film is my favorite Criterion film I have seen so far. It is just incredible. Yes, well done. Yes, and the Criterion release, I should say, is great because it includes certain scenes that weren't otherwise included in the earlier like VHS release that I had. In particular, there is a scene in the Temple of the Golden Pavilion with that includes the great actor, the great Japanese actor, Chishu Ryu. And this wasn't included in the VHS release. And so to have this back in the film, so to speak, is amazing. I mean, because, absolutely amazing. So, let's see. Okay. MBP says, it's not as if Schrader's mind was as a vacuum in this case, though. I'm sorry, maybe I skipped a comment that you made earlier. Let's see. Koth says, Mishima seems to utilize every possible aspect of filmmaking to its fullest. The movie feels more like an experience than a film. It blows my mind. That's a very good way of putting it. It feels more like an experience than a film. Yes, and I would also, I would borrow that approach, which I think is lovely, well put, and I would say that this is a film that's like an impression of his life rather than a depiction, a biographical depiction of his life. It's an impression of Mishima. Thomas Wilkie says hello. Hello, it's nice to see you. Maximus 1908 says, really wish I watched the situation with the live chat. Yes, I recommend that you see the film. It's really memorable, a really unique viewing experience. Okay. Great. Steve. Oh, and Steve and Tim Holm, hello. It's nice to see you. Steve Vincent Furness, my friend. My friend, I hope you're well, Steve Vincent Furness. I should say also, Steve Vincent Furness is a dear friend of mine, and we go way back. He is one of the first. Steve Vincent Furness' channel is one of the channels that really influenced me to start YouTube to begin with. Steve was one of the people that I met first, the earliest, and we connected. And he and his lovely family, and his comments about film and cinema and the Criterion Collection and Laserdiscs. And so Steve Vincent Furness is his influence on me and my YouTube channel is just so great. And so Steve Vincent Furness, you have to check out Steve Vincent Furness's channel. He is one of my dearest friends that I've made here on YouTube and online. What a great guy. So Steve, it's lovely to see you. Lovely to. I hope you're well. We have to talk again very soon, my friend. Okay, sorry, I'm just going back through the chat here because I might have missed a lot of people, so sorry about this, and just go from there. Let's see, Big W Studio says, just got this film in the mail today, can't wait to watch it. Yes, please let me know, please let us know what you think of the film when you get a chance. Justin Peterson, hello. Really interesting film with beautiful sets, and that score to kick things off was amazing. Thanks for spreading the word on this one. Yeah, I really have to say one more thing about the Philip Glass score. You know, one of the things I love is I love the score so much, and I love the score so much. I love trying to searching for covers of the themes of Mishima. And, you know, it was used in The Truman Show, right? I don't know if you know The Truman Show, but the opening theme of Mishima is used in The Truman Show. It's really great. Heirloom Providence says, planning on watching tonight after a marathon of Berlin Alexanderplatz. Great. Carl Reese, hello. Sorry I'm late to the party. Not at all. It's nice to see you, my friend. Transport and Stuff 808. Probably one of the greatest films ever made. Wow, that's a bold statement. Well done. I have never seen a film that really took advantage of set design. It is clearly a film screaming for attention, but sadly it's underrated. Yes, the set design. Eiko Ishioka. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit over time, but I really have to mention this. Eiko Ishioka's set design is amazing. Those sets for the three sequences, the novel sequences, out of this world. Wildly impractical in many places, as you'll note in the commentary. Sometimes she didn't make doors in certain things, which is nuts in terms of practical sets for filmmaking and stuff. But still, it just and I think there was a lot of she was making a lot of demands on the crew. But you know, regardless of all that, I mean the results, the artistic results, unparalleled. Completely bizarre. They just jump off the screen. It's like a different film altogether. What's going on? And the way it ties in is just, it's so perfect, right? Because it shows the extravagance and virtuosity and just audacity of Yukio Mishima and his artistic sensibilities. It's perfect, absolutely perfect. So well done. Yes. Transport and Stuff 808. I agree. So yes, well done indeed. Okay, so just Bird Dog Freeman. Hello, my friend. Yes. I wonder if seppuku has gone out of fashion in Japan. I don't know. I'm not sure what that means, but it's certainly something that no one did in 1970, that's for sure. So, let's see. Oh, and I should say that, excuse me here, there's, okay, so I should say also that you should also check out the supplement, which is an amalgam of two interviews, one with John Nathan and the other with Donald Ritchie. And Donald Ritchie's interview is also very interesting because he knew Mishima. He interacted with Mishima. And in fact, he met Mishima, he had dinner with Mishima maybe, according to him, maybe a month before his suicide. And it's Donald Ritchie's story about what they talked about during that last dinner. And Mishima was, according to Donald Ritchie, Mishima was fixated with talking about the Japanese historical figure Saigo Takamori, who's known as being the last samurai, if you will. And he had his own suicide as well, and he's talking about the last samurai, and focusing on him. And then a month later, he killed himself. And when Donald Ritchie heard that, he said, "Oh, Mishima, it wasn't Takamori that was the last samurai. It was Mishima that was the last samurai." And then Donald Ritchie says, "I played my part," which is so. That's such a comment to make in an interview, because it's suggestive of the fact that Donald Ritchie appreciated, or at least knew, that although he was friends with Mishima, he knew that in many ways Mishima was kind of using Donald Ritchie to further perpetuate this notion of the myth of the samurai vis-a-vis Yukio Mishima. Wow, it blows my mind when I think about that. But anyway, so let's see here. Just going through the comments here. And just calling it a day, and because it's after 8, so it's 8 in the morning here, so I've been up since 5, so I should have to, I want to go, I don't understand here. Don't understand. Sometimes I should note here that YouTube sometimes holds comments for review. I don't know why. If you've written a comment in and it doesn't show up, maybe it's just held for review and I just haven't pushed the button. So I apologize. I've skipped over it perhaps. But Tim Holm, thank you Tim, you didn't have to do that, my friend. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. Your super chat. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Again, completely not necessary, but the sentiment is so appreciated. Thank you, my dear friend. Thank you. That's very kind of you. One day, if I have the pleasure of meeting you in person, then I will pay you back with a beer or a soft drink or another drink of your choosing. So, let's see. So, Paul Emery says, Mishima knew his coup attempt would fail. I'm not so sure it was for honor as it might be attributed to vanity. This is a very good point, and I didn't mention it before, and I know I'm going over, but I really want to mention this because Paul's comment is great here. Okay. Yes, the act that he committed November 25th, 1970 he probably knew that it was going to lead nowhere politically. It was going to lead to a coup d'etat, right? It wasn't going to lead to a coup d'etat. There are people who suggest that perhaps he really believed this, and this was an actual overt political act. Who knows? We don't know what was in Mishima's mind at the time. It was a very complex, complicated mind, of course. Okay, but it's probably the case that we can reasonably assume that he realistically wasn't expecting this to lead to an actual coup d'etat. Was it therefore a non-political act? I don't think we can go that far either. But I think we can say also that instead of it being a 100% political act, which I don't think it was, I think we can also say that it was also a kind of ultimate performance art, right, which I think was how I mentioned it before. This was an ultimate performance art, and I affix the adjective ultimate here because it led to his suicide, which is the ultimate form of expression of devotion from a certain point of view. So if it can be described as being a kind of performance art, then the question is, did Mishima really believe that this would have been leading anywhere? Paul Schrader and Alan Poole in the commentary seem to be on the same page as Paul Emery in his comment here. And I am actually on the same page as that as well. And I think that's a reasonable approach to make. However, what's so interesting about this film, which is why I love this film so much, you take a look at that scene again. Ken Ogata's performance is so lovely here because you can tell there's a moment when he realizes it's not going to work out, at least according to the kind of coup d'etat, pro-coup d'etat script, okay. It's not going to work out because the garrison is just booing him, jeering him. It's like he's on a stage, right? He's on a stage, and it's like the audience is booing him. Get off the stage. Get out. If they had tomatoes, they'd probably throw tomatoes, right? Something like that, right? The old cliche in theater, okay. But there is a moment where Ken Ogata he's like shocked. His face is registering shock, almost like there are tears in his eyes or something. I don't know. What does this mean? Was there a moment where his depiction of Mishima, did his Mishima for a moment really believe that his coup d'etat would work? Therefore, the fact that he is so sad means that he is disappointed that the fact that the troops aren't rallying behind him. Is that what that meant? Or is it also an element of the performance art? Namely, is this also an aspect of his performance? He is so into his performance that he is acting his almost teary-eyed face. Which then leads into a very controversial moment in the scene, which I didn't mention, which is the Ken no Heika Banzai, which is the two of them then stand and salute the emperor 3 times. This wouldn't have been done. This doesn't occur. And this point was raised, I think, very appropriately by Alan Poole in the commentary. This is very controversial. This is such a controversial moment. But when we go back into the room, we still see tears or potential tears welling up in Mishima's eyes. What does this mean? Was he disappointed in the coup d'etat? Is his fear in the fact that he knows that he is about to die? Is it something? Is it performance? Is it an act? If it's an act, does that mean it's a lie? All this stuff is so fascinating. And Ken Ogata's choices here as an actor make this so much more complicated as a moment, because it could have been just a moment of theater, and it could have been taken as a moment of theater. But the fact that Ken Ogata adds these nuances to the performance, added to the fact that we have, again, as I mentioned earlier in this live stream, the moment of epiphany, that is the shots of the F1, the jet, and the narration from Sun and Steel, the reconciliation between art and action, the principle that unites these two, according to Mishima, that he realizes is death. And the moment where the black and white sun becomes the color sun, the black and white images of the flashbacks become the present of the color. Everything comes together at this moment. And in fact, the moment where the narration kicks in and the music kicks in that scene where he's giving his speech is the moment when the troops start booing him and where he realizes the disappointment. It's amazing timing if you think about it. That's the moment where he says, he feels alive as an artist because he realizes that the two principles are merging into one. It's a strange moment to introduce that, if you think about it, because it's the precise moment in the speech where he is losing the crowd, right? So it's in fact the moment where he is actually failing in terms of the art, because the art, if he wants to, if he's measuring success of his art in the way in which his audience is reacting, and that's the point where his art is failing the most, because he's lost the crowd by then, he's lost the audience, he's lost the room. But that's the point where the music comes in and the narration comes in for that is borrowed from Sun and Steel. And so that suggests to me that the film is depicting this moment of disappointment, or when he quote unquote loses the room. This is the moment of ultimate artistic expression, at least in the context of this speech that he gives, which is therefore suggestive to me that the success of the speech is not in winning the audience over. No, the success of the speech is in the speech itself, which therefore leads me to the interpretation that, right, this is the film's, right, the film's interpretation, the film's take on this moment, that this is, the importance of this act is not to try to convince the troops to go along with the coup d'etat. The point of this is the scene itself. All the significance that it holds because of everything that we've seen in the film up to that point, which is made even more complicated by the nuanced layering provided by Ken Ogata. It is such a brilliant moment, such a brilliant moment. I can't tell you. Every time I see this moment, it's just I'm almost out of breath. It's staggering. And the way in which everything comes together, this key moment, it's almost like this is to me the climax of the film, more so than the aftermath, which is what happens at the very end, which is beautiful in itself, very lyrical, very poetic. But this is to me such a critical moment. This is the focal point of the entire film for me. Yes, so Paul, thank you very much for that great comment. Thank you. Okay, so let's see here. And so now I think it's time for me. Oh, Austin, no whack. Hello. Thank you very much. And I thank you so much for your super chats. It's very kind of you. Very, very kind of you. Thank you very much indeed, my friend. Very much appreciated. And yes, so great. And Tim Holmes says, let's see. Yes, Tim Holmes talking about other Schrader works. I don't have time to talk about them, but it would, yes, of course, they're very significant. Yes, at least in the context of how the kind of connections that we can see that have already been established. Paul and Leonard Schrader on the one hand, and Japanese culture, so to speak, on the other hand, sort of in broad brushstrokes, perhaps. So. Okay, so I'm going to have to call it a day. So thank you very much for joining this discussion of Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters. This is very great. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for your lovely comments and wonderful contributions as always. I should say that the next live stream will be decided in a couple days. The poll is still ongoing, which I have on the community tab of my YouTube channel. So if you haven't voted, please go to that section of the YouTube page and vote. I think at the moment, what is it? I haven't checked today, but I think at the moment it's still pretty close between 12 Angry Men and Paris, Texas. So either of those would be very interesting indeed. But if you haven't voted, please vote, because again, this Film Club live stream is, I'm only just one part of it. A very significant part of it is also you and your contributions and your input and your comments and your views and opinions. So it's my pleasure, my sincerest pleasure, to be able to be a part of this with you. It's really great. Thank you very much for allowing me to be a part. So with that in mind, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great, great films. And if you want to talk with me more about this film, Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, please do so. I feel like you guys have talked so much and you're great, but I feel like my comments have just been so sort of inadequate, and I haven't spoken about all the aspects that I want to talk about here. It's just overwhelming in terms of how much I really admire this film. And in many ways, it's a real shame that this film hasn't been given a lot of attention in Japan, which I think it deserves. It deserves so much attention in Japan, and it hasn't gotten it. Ken Ogata, who passed away, never really saw the reaction of Japanese cinema goers to his performance, which is really sad, as well as other aspects of the cast and crew, of course. But I do recommend that if you haven't gotten it, the Criterion Collection release is the one to get, and the supplements are great. The commentary is dynamite. The Chieko Schrader interview is fantastic. It's audio only, but it's fantastic. The John Nathan, John Ritchie interviews are fantastic. The supplement about the making of the film with John Bailey, Philip Glass, and Eiko Ishioka is great. You also have the interview with Mishima himself, where he speaks parts of the interview in French. Great, and other aspects as well. But anyway, highly recommended. So if you haven't gotten it, I know it's also available to watch on the Criterion channel. Am I correct in saying that? So if you don't want to get this Blu-ray, because I think it's still very expensive, you can watch it on the Criterion channel. Although I think as of now, this filming, the Barnes & Noble sale is still going on. But if it's something that you might want to get during a sale, it might be something at least to consider. So anyway, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great films. So until we meet again, cheers. Thank you very much. And we're done. So thank you very much, my friends, for your time. And I hope you are well and that you have a great rest of your day or evening, wherever you are in the world. So cheers, and talk to you again very soon.